For most of his life, Donald Trump has sold himself as a successful businessman. He did it first as a minor New York celebrity, and then as a reality TV host, and then, however improbably, as a candidate for president of the United States. Trump's main asset, his selling point, if you will, the reason we were all supposed to take him seriously, was he was the successful leader of the real estate empire that bears his name. But today, a judge in New York found that Trump's business empire has been built, in part, on rampant fraud. And the judge ordered the dissolution of Trump's businesses in the state of New York. Here's what he wrote. Ordered that any certificates filed by any of the entity defendants or by any other entity controlled or beneficially owned by Donald J. Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg, and Trump Organization controller Jeffrey McConney are canceled. To put that in layman's terms, for now, the Trump Organization effectively has an out-of-order sign hanging on it, at least in terms of its businesses in New York State, which, again, in this moment, at this hour, is a fairly staggering development for the man whose entire reputation was built on his alleged business acumen. It is also not all that this judge has decided. Because of this order, several of the crown jewels in Trump's real estate empire, the properties upon which he built his brand, those properties are now in limbo. The precise impact of today's ruling has yet to be seen, but Trump could lose control of properties including Trump Park Avenue, which is his luxury skyscraper in Manhattan's Lenox Hill neighborhood. He could lose control of 40 Wall Street, the historic tower Trump owns in the financial district. He could lose control of his Seven Springs Golf Club in Bedford, New York. Even his apartment in Trump Tower, the Gilded Bunker, in which he has sought refuge in his home city. Trump could lose control of that. Maybe even the Golden Toilet, too. So today's ruling was not good for Mr. Trump and his defense team. And the judge here, Judge Arthur Engoron, made very clear what he thought of the defense. Also, again, as part of his ruling. The judge accused the defense of living in a fantasy world, not the real world. He accused the defense of obstreperous conduct and reliance on bogus arguments and intentional and blatant disregard of controlling authority and law of the case. He admonished Trump's legal team in no uncertain terms and wrote, "Sophisticated counsel should have known better." So again, not a great day for the Trump defense on this one. Trump's team announced tonight that they plan to appeal this ruling, but for now, all of this looks like pretty good news for New York Attorney General Letitia James, whose case against the Trump Organization is expected to officially go to trial on Monday, which is 6 days from today. And Judge Engoron, the same judge who just accused Trump's team of living in a fantasy world, he will be the presiding judge in that case. Out of that trial, we are likely to find out the fate of Trump's empire, whether he will lose control of his numerous properties, and whether he and his sons will ever be allowed to do business in New York State again. Joining me now are Laura Jarrett, senior legal correspondent for NBC News, and investigative journalist Suzanne Craig, one of the lead reporters in the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into Trump's finances. Sue, Laura, I'm so thrilled to have you. Help me understand. I read this ruling, and I've gotten slightly better at understanding. This one was tough for me, I'm not going to lie. Laura, I understood this to be a fairly devastating rebuke for Trump's defense. Is that how you're reading it?
I think the plain language, the scathing language, in particular, the judge seems angry that his words weren't taken seriously over and over again, essentially telling them, I warned you about these arguments last time, and yet you continued to make them. They're borderline frivolous, so much so that he has ordered sanctions against the lawyers. Yes. This is not something you see often, but the judge is clearly so angry about what he calls glaring misrepresentations. That's an embarrassing thing to receive as an attorney. You never want to have that associated with your name.
And fines of, I think, $7,500
against
each
of the people who signed on to the briefs that he said were borderline frivolous. I think the question mark, for what Susan and I have been talking about is, what is the practical implication of having a business canceled? But for all intents and purposes, the judge that is going to be trying this case clearly has strong feelings about the defendants and their arguments, which does not bode well for what is supposed to go to trial on Monday, what's left of this case.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm Trump's defense, I'm not excited about Monday, given that this is what we got from the judge today. But
it's not a jury trial, by the way. It's from the bench.
Right.
So the guy who handed this down today, the judge,
he's the decider.
Monday morning, he's there to decide the rest.
How are you? I mean, there are a lot of questions. The wording there about in our script, as I read that, is very careful. It's for now. It's kind of an out-of-order sign hanging over the Trump organization.
And I want to be careful about that because there's going to immediately be appeal. So that's the first one. Of course, he's going to appeal it. But there's going to be a receiver put in. And so
a receiver to control the assets.
So
is that right?
Right. And it's going to be in the interest of, I think, in the short term for those properties to do well. We're not going to all of a sudden see an immediate
liquidation
sale or anything like that. And I think there's going to be, if there is a sale, if that's what results, it's going to be a very controlled sale because potentially the proceeds of the sale of, say, the commercial area of Trump Tower or Seven Springs, the estate that he owns, or one of the golf courses, could go as disgorgement to pay whatever fine ultimately happens at the end of the court case.
Can we just talk about that for a second? Yeah. Disgorgement, I got caught up in that. But effectively, Letitia James is calling for $250 million.
That's a lot of money.
A lot of money. There's a huge question about how liquid Trump is at this stage and whether, to your point, he may need to sell off some of these properties. Is that right? If in fact the judge rules in favor of Letitia James.
Well, I think if the end of it and we keep rolling and there's appeals, we could very well see a sale of some of his New York assets that potentially could go to pay the fine.
And in the interim,
which is a huge fine for him.
A massive fine.
It's a massive fine. It's not tax deductible, and it's not a good.
You can't write it down,
right? And we're not heading towards a moment now where that fine won't be $250. It might be $100. We have, this was devastating today. He was found liable on the fraud stuff. That was the main charge. There's going to be some other trial. Likely will start Monday. There's one more legal maneuver coming this week, but we would expect it to go ahead Monday. And there's going to be other things that are going to be adjudicated. But the main one was that fraud charge, and that's done.
To the question of what practically happens to the businesses, Laura, it seems like a very real possibility that the Trumps will not be allowed to do business in the state of New York ever again.
Well,
How are you reading the sort of tea leaves in this as it pertains to that ultimate question?
Well, I think that's part of why this was always sort of the wild card case for the business and the family. And there's been obviously so much focus on the 4 criminal indictments, and for good reason. There are criminal cases. This is a civil case. This is not about jail time. But it is about the business, the reputation, the family's stake, and interest in something that clearly was important to them. And look, if you're a lender reading this, is this a business that you want to engage with anymore? And perhaps they already had reputational risk. And their point all along is, look, you should have done your own due diligence. You shouldn't have relied on our statements of financial condition. You should have dug in for yourself. But truly, if you're a lender looking at this, is this a business that you want to engage with?
Well, let's talk about the statements of financial condition, because all along, this is the juicy part of the discussion, but it truly is. This is the thing upon which so much of Trump's defense rests here, which is these statements of financial condition. They're not independently audited. They're meaningless. And the judge today ripped that argument apart. I think he says defendants' reliance on these worthless disclaimers is in and of itself worthless.
It was incredible because the hearing for what came today was on Friday, and I was there for it. And just to hear Trump's lawyers at the beginning, actually both sides sort of felt like they started with the phrase, we feel like we've walked through the looking glass. Like it was really just like a house of mirrors, like the way they were just going through all their reasons why these financial statements were worthless. There were caveats on them. Well, there's just a lot of variation. Well, the banks do their own due diligence themselves, and so they submitted all these documents knowing, that these weren't just a little bit off. This was something that he, is maybe worth $20 million. He said it's worth 150 million. And at one point, the judge, and maybe we all should have seen this coming today, the judge, and I've written it, I don't even want to paraphrase it, it was so good. He was so angry, he started pounding on his desk and looking at the Trump lawyers, and he said, you cannot make false statements and use them in business. That's what the statute prohibits. And he was just furious. He was just like, shut up.
There was no gray area for him.
No, and he was really angry about it because they had all these excuses for why these financial statements were essentially worthless. You know, I think the main one being that the banks do their own due diligence.
Right.
Well, you still submitted them as a document to a financial institution, in other cases, insurance companies. There are rules about that. And that's what the judge was saying.
And that
furious.
portends very poorly for what else needs to be resolved in this trial on Monday, right, Laura?
Well, and it's part of why, again, the fact that it's a civil case makes a difference here. The bar is lower. The judge makes it clear intent is not required.
Right.
Materiality, meaning it actually mattered to the party. And so the question is, well, if the lenders and the banks weren't upset, they didn't sue, they didn't have any damage. The judge says none of that actually matters for purposes of just the plain vanilla fraud case.
Yeah.
You don't need any of that. Now, he may need it for some of the other claims that are actually going to trial on Monday. But as for just that, all you needed was that there were false representations, and that's it.
It's a great point because in this case, you know, you think of a normal trial who are, you know, the victims. The banks in this case, the loans actually performed.
Right.
So they're not, you know,
that was the case Trump was making.
Right.
Nobody lost any money. What's the problem
they
here?
all did well. It doesn't matter.